Henry Morgenthau Jr. was a New York financier and public servant who became one of the most influential yet often overlooked figures in Franklin Roosevelt's administration. Henry Morgenthau Jr., Democratic politician, financier and reformer, was born in New York City on May 11, 1891. He came from a wealthy and prominent Jewish family. He had a reserved demeanor but possessed unwavering loyalty and exceptional administrative ability. Morgenthau's early years were marked by privilege and social consciousness. He attended Phillips Exeter Academy and later Cornell University, studying architecture and agriculture, though he left before graduating in 1913. His education there shaped his understanding of rural economics and land management, though his later career would test those principles in ways he could never have imagined. After leaving college, Morgenthau purchased a farm in Dutchess County, New York, seeking to prove himself outside his father's shadow. His father, Henry Morgenthau Sr., was a successful real estate developer and diplomat who served as ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. The younger Morgenthau wanted to establish his own identity, and farming seemed to offer that opportunity. He became a gentleman farmer, experimenting with modern agricultural techniques and dairy production. During this time, Morgenthau was already developing his interest in rural economics and agricultural policy. He became active in farm organizations and agricultural improvement societies. His practical experience with farming gave him insights that would prove valuable in his later government service. In 1916, Morgenthau married Eleanor Fatman, the daughter of a wealthy industrialist. Eleanor was an intelligent and socially conscious woman who shared Morgenthau's progressive values. She became his partner in every sense, supporting his political ambitions and sharing his commitment to public service. Their marriage was a genuine partnership, and Eleanor's influence on Morgenthau's career cannot be overstated. They would have 3 children together, and the family remained close throughout Morgenthau's demanding career in government service. Morgenthau's life changed dramatically when he met Franklin Roosevelt in the early 1920s. Roosevelt, recovering from polio at his estate in Hyde Park, was also a Dutchess County resident. The two men became neighbors and friends, bonding over their shared interest in agriculture and progressive politics. Morgenthau supported Roosevelt's political comeback, and when Roosevelt was elected governor of New York in 1928, he appointed Morgenthau as chairman of the Agricultural Advisory Commission. This was Morgenthau's entry into government service, and he approached it with characteristic diligence and attention to detail. As agricultural advisor to Governor Roosevelt, Morgenthau worked on programs to help struggling farmers during the agricultural depression that preceded the general economic collapse. He advocated for lower taxes on farmland, better rural credit facilities, and conservation programs. His work brought him into close contact with Roosevelt, and their friendship deepened. Morgenthau became one of Roosevelt's most trusted advisors, valued for his loyalty, discretion, and administrative competence. When Roosevelt ran for president in 1932, Morgenthau was part of his inner circle, though he remained in the background. After Roosevelt's election, Morgenthau expected to be appointed to an agricultural position, perhaps as Secretary of Agriculture. Instead, Roosevelt named him head of the Federal Farm Board and later appointed him governor of the Farm Credit Administration. These positions gave Morgenthau responsibility for refinancing farm mortgages and providing credit to struggling farmers. He threw himself into the work, traveling throughout the country and establishing lending programs that saved thousands of farms from foreclosure. His success in this role demonstrated his administrative abilities and his understanding of rural economic problems. In 1934, Roosevelt made a surprising decision that would define Morgenthau's career. When Treasury Secretary William Woodin resigned due to illness, Roosevelt appointed Morgenthau to replace him. The appointment shocked many observers. Morgenthau had no background in finance or banking. He was not an economist or a Wall Street insider. He was a farmer and agricultural administrator. Critics questioned whether he was qualified for one of the most important positions in government, but Roosevelt knew what he was doing. He wanted a Treasury Secretary he could trust completely, someone who would be loyal to him personally and committed to his policies. Morgenthau was that person. Morgenthau served as Secretary of the Treasury from 1934 to 1945, making him the second longest-serving Treasury Secretary in American history. His tenure spanned the New Deal, the Second World War, and the creation of the post-war international financial system. He approached the position with humility, surrounding himself with talented economists and financial experts who could compensate for his lack of technical expertise. He was an excellent administrator who could master complex details and make decisions quickly. Most importantly, he had Roosevelt's complete confidence and saw the president almost daily. As Treasury Secretary during the New Deal, Morgenthau was responsible for financing Roosevelt's programs. The federal government was running substantial deficits to fund relief programs, public works, and agricultural subsidies. Morgenthau had to sell government bonds to raise the necessary funds while maintaining confidence in American credit. He was more fiscally conservative than many New Dealers, often urging Roosevelt to balance the budget and reduce spending. He worried about the growing national debt and the long-term consequences of deficit spending, yet he remained loyal to Roosevelt and implemented policies he sometimes doubted. The tension between Morgenthau's fiscal conservatism and Roosevelt's spending programs created ongoing conflicts. In 1937, Roosevelt agreed to cut spending in an attempt to balance the budget, partly in response to Morgenthau's urgings. The result was a severe recession that undid much of the economic recovery achieved since 1933. Unemployment rose sharply and the stock market collapsed. The recession of 1937 to 1938 was a political disaster for Roosevelt and a policy failure that haunted Morgenthau. He had advocated for spending cuts that proved economically harmful. The experience taught him that his economic instincts were not always correct, and that deficit spending might be necessary during Depression conditions. Morgenthau's most important work came during World War II. As the war approached, he became increasingly concerned about Nazi Germany and the threat it posed to Jews and to democratic nations. As a Jew himself, Morgenthau was acutely aware of Nazi persecution. He urged Roosevelt to take stronger action against Germany and to help Jewish refugees. He supported aid to Britain and France before the United States entered the war. When war came, Morgenthau threw himself into the effort to finance America's military mobilization. Financing World War II was an enormous undertaking. The United States spent over $300 billion on the war, a sum beyond anything previously imagined. Morgenthau had to raise this money through taxation and borrowing. He oversaw a massive expansion of the income tax, which for the first time became a mass tax paid by most Americans rather than just the wealthy. He organized war bond drives that sold billions of dollars in bonds to ordinary citizens. He worked with the Federal Reserve to manage interest rates and the money supply. His administrative skills were tested as never before, and he proved equal to the challenge. Morgenthau also played a role in economic warfare against the Axis powers. The Treasury Department controlled foreign exchange and could freeze assets of enemy nations. Morgenthau used these powers aggressively, blocking German and Japanese assets and working to prevent neutral countries from trading with the Axis. He supported the use of economic pressure as a weapon of war. Some of his actions were controversial, particularly his efforts to prevent American companies from trading with the enemy through neutral intermediaries, but Morgenthau believed that economic warfare was essential to victory. The most controversial aspect of Morgenthau's wartime service was his response to the Holocaust. As reports of Nazi atrocities reached Washington, Morgenthau became increasingly frustrated with the State Department's failure to help Jewish refugees. The State Department, dominated by career diplomats who were often anti-Semitic or indifferent to Jewish suffering, blocked efforts to rescue Jews from Nazi-occupied Europe. Morgenthau discovered that State Department officials had actively suppressed information about the Holocaust and had prevented rescue efforts. In January 1944, Morgenthau presented Roosevelt with a report titled Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jews. The report documented the State Department's failures and called for immediate action. Roosevelt, shocked by the revelations and pressured by Morgenthau, created the War Refugee Board to coordinate rescue efforts. The board, largely funded and staffed by the Treasury Department, saved tens of thousands of Jews in the final years of the war. Morgenthau's intervention came late, and most European Jews had already been murdered, but his actions represented one of the few bright spots in America's response to the Holocaust. Morgenthau also played a crucial role in planning the post-war international economic system. In 1944, he led the American delegation to the Bretton Woods Conference, which created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. These institutions were designed to promote international trade, stabilize currencies, and provide development assistance. The Bretton Woods system established the dollar as the world's reserve currency and created a framework for international economic cooperation that lasted for decades. Morgenthau presided over the conference with skill, managing complex negotiations among dozens of nations. The success of Bretton Woods was one of his greatest achievements. However, Morgenthau's plan for post-war Germany was far less successful. He proposed that Germany be deindustrialized and converted into an agricultural nation to prevent it from ever again threatening world peace. The Morgenthau Plan, as it became known, called for dismantling German factories, flooding mines, and destroying industrial capacity. Germany would be partitioned and reduced to a pastoral economy. The plan reflected Morgenthau's anger at Nazi atrocities and his determination to prevent German resurgence, but it was economically impractical and politically unwise. When details of the Morgenthau Plan leaked to the press in 1944, it caused a political firestorm. Critics accused Morgenthau of wanting to starve millions of Germans. Nazi propaganda used the plan to stiffen German resistance, warning that the Allies intended to destroy Germany completely. Even within the Roosevelt administration, the plan had few supporters. The State Department and War Department opposed it as too harsh and economically foolish. Roosevelt initially seemed to support the plan but quickly backed away when controversy erupted. The Morgenthau plan was quietly shelved, and Morgenthau was embarrassed by the episode. It showed that his judgment on some issues was clouded by emotion and that his influence had limits. When Roosevelt died in April 1945, Morgenthau lost his greatest supporter. He had been close to Roosevelt for over 20 years, closer than almost anyone except Eleanor Roosevelt and Harry Hopkins. Roosevelt's death was personally devastating and politically fatal for Morgenthau. The new president, Harry Truman, did not have the same relationship with Morgenthau. Truman had his own advisors and his own priorities. He was also more conservative than Roosevelt on some economic issues and less sympathetic to Morgenthau's views. Morgenthau hoped to continue as Treasury Secretary under Truman, but it soon became clear that Truman wanted his own team. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, Truman excluded Morgenthau from important meetings and ignored his advice. Morgenthau realized he was no longer welcome. He submitted his resignation in July 1945, just 3 months after Roosevelt's death. His departure marked the end of an era. He had served as Treasury Secretary for 11 years through depression and war and had been one of the most powerful men in Washington. Now he was leaving office with little ceremony and uncertain prospects. After leaving government, Morgenthau struggled to find a new role. He was only 54 years old and still energetic, but he had no clear purpose. He returned to his farm in Dutchess County and tried to resume his life as a gentleman farmer, but farming no longer satisfied him. He had been at the center of world events for too long to be content with rural life. He wrote his memoirs and gave occasional speeches, but he missed the action and influence he had enjoyed in government. Morgenthau became increasingly involved in Jewish causes and Zionist organizations. He had always been conscious of his Jewish identity, but the Holocaust had deepened his commitment to Jewish survival. He supported the creation of Israel and raised funds for Jewish refugees and Israeli development. He served as chairman of the United Jewish Appeal and traveled to Israel several times. His work for Israel gave him a sense of purpose and allowed him to use his fundraising and organizational skills. He became a prominent figure in the American Jewish community, though he never achieved the influence in this sphere that he had enjoyed in government. His wife Eleanor died in 1949, a devastating loss that left Morgenthau lonely and depressed. They had been married for 33 years and had been true partners. Her death removed an important source of emotional support and companionship. Morgenthau eventually remarried in 1951 to Marcel Puthan Hirsch, a French-born widow, but the second marriage never achieved the intimacy of his first. Morgenthau remained active in democratic politics and occasionally advised Democratic candidates, but his influence was limited. The Democratic Party was changing, and Morgenthau's New Deal liberalism seemed old-fashioned to a new generation of politicians. He supported Adlai Stevenson's presidential campaigns in 1952 and 1956, but Stevenson lost both times. Morgenthau watched from the sidelines as younger men shaped policy and won elections. He had become a figure from the past, respected for his service but no longer relevant to current debates. In his final years, Morgenthau divided his time between New York and his farm. He remained interested in public affairs and followed political developments closely. He was pleased when John Kennedy was elected president in 1960, seeing it as a revival of democratic progressivism, though Kennedy did not seek his advice. He lived long enough to see the early years of the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson, programs that echoed the New Deal he had helped finance. Henry Morgenthau Jr. died on February 6, 1967 at his home in Poughkeepsie, New York. He was 75 years old. The cause of death was not widely reported, but he had been in declining health for some time. His funeral was attended by many prominent figures from the Roosevelt administration and the Jewish community. He was buried in Mount Hope Cemetery in Hastings-on-Hudson, New York. Obituaries praised his service as Treasury Secretary and his work for Jewish causes, though most focused on his role in financing World War II rather than his broader contributions. Morgenthau's legacy is substantial but often underappreciated. He served as Treasury Secretary during two of the most critical periods in American history, the Great Depression and World War II. He financed the New Deal and the war effort, managing the largest expansion of government spending in American history. He helped create the Bretton Woods system that governed international finance for decades. He intervened to help Holocaust victims when others did nothing. Yet he is not well remembered today outside of specialist histories. Part of the reason for this obscurity is that Morgenthau was never a public figure in the way that other Roosevelt advisors were. He did not give major speeches or write books that shaped public opinion. He worked behind the scenes, managing the Treasury Department and advising Roosevelt privately. He was a competent administrator rather than a visionary thinker. His contributions were technical and organizational rather than intellectual or rhetorical. History tends to remember the orators and the theorists more than the administrators, however essential their work. Morgenthau also suffered from being overshadowed by Roosevelt. He was so closely identified with Roosevelt that his own achievements were attributed to the president. He was seen as Roosevelt's loyal servant rather than an independent force. This was partly true. Morgenthau was indeed intensely loyal to Roosevelt and rarely opposed him publicly, but it underestimates Morgenthau's own contributions. He shaped policy in important ways, particularly on fiscal matters and Jewish refugee issues. He was more than just Roosevelt's instrument, though he never sought to claim credit for himself. The Morgenthau Plan remains a stain on his reputation. Even though the plan was never implemented and was quickly abandoned, it is often cited as evidence of Morgenthau's vindictiveness and poor judgment. Critics use it to portray him as driven by ethnic hatred rather than rational policy considerations. This is unfair, as the plan reflected widespread anger at Nazi atrocities and a genuine desire to prevent future German aggression. But the plan was nonetheless ill-conceived, and Morgenthau must bear responsibility for proposing it. Modern historians have given Morgenthau more credit than his contemporaries did. They recognize that financing the war effort was an enormous achievement that required skill, dedication, and innovation. They acknowledge that his intervention on behalf of Holocaust victims, while late, saved lives and represented moral courage. They note that his work at Bretton Woods helped create an international economic system that promoted prosperity and stability. They understand that his loyalty to Roosevelt, while sometimes excessive, was rooted in genuine friendship and shared values. Yet even with these reassessments, Morgenthau remains a secondary figure in histories of the Roosevelt administration. He appears in supporting roles, advising Roosevelt or implementing policies, but rarely at the center of the narrative. This reflects the reality of his position. He was important but not indispensable, influential but not dominant. He was one of many talented people who served Roosevelt, and while he served longer than most, he was not the most creative or the most influential. Perhaps the most fitting assessment of Henry Morgenthau Jr. is that he was an exceptionally competent public servant who used his position to advance causes he believed in. He was not a great thinker or a charismatic leader. He was not a political innovator or a policy visionary. He was a skilled administrator, a loyal friend, and a dedicated public servant who did his job well during extraordinarily difficult times. His work financing the New Deal and World War II was essential to American success, even if it was not glamorous or memorable. Morgenthau represents a particular type of American leader, the competent insider who serves loyally and effectively without seeking personal glory. History needs such figures, even if it does not always remember them. Governments require administrators who can manage complex operations, make difficult decisions, and implement policies effectively. Morgenthau excelled at these tasks. His tragedy, if it can be called that, was not failure but obscurity. He succeeded at what he attempted but is forgotten by those who benefited from his success. In the end, Henry Morgenthau Jr. was neither a hero nor a villain, but rather a capable public servant who rose to meet the challenges of his time. His legacy includes the financing of America's victory in World War II, the creation of international financial institutions, and efforts to save Holocaust victims. He is remembered today, when he is remembered at all, as Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary and as a voice for Jewish causes. This is perhaps inadequate recognition for a man who served his country faithfully for 11 crucial years, but history is often unkind to those who work in the shadows of greater men.